All right, welcome everybody. First of our afternoon panels. This is going to be on the Three Musketeers of Weird Tales. H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and
Robert E. Howard.
Robert E. Howard.
Robert E.
That's right. Yeah, we're gonna be talking about these three guys and why they were so integral to Weird Tales. It's part of our celebration of the 100th anniversary of Weird Tales, the unique magazine. So let's kick things off. We're going to start down at this end. Bobby, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Bobby Derie. I'm a pulp scholar. I've written books like Weird Tailors, essays on Robert E. Howard and others, which you can buy at the gift shop. If I haven't signed it, I'll come and sign it.
I'm Jeff Shanks. I'm just another Howard scholar. I co-edited The Unique Legacy of Weird Tales, a collection of academic essays on the magazine a few years back. I do a lot of work on Howard's world building. That's kind of my thing. Mark?
I'm Mark Finn. I'm an author and an editor and an essayist, and I am probably best known for Blood and Thunder, The Life and Art of Robert E. Howard, but I can also be found in a lot of other books by just about everybody in the room. So, yeah.
All right, well, let's jump right in. How many people here went to the 100 Years of Weird Tales earlier today, right? So you got a lot of the backstory, of the magazine a little bit. And we often talk about Howard, Lovecraft, and Smith. We call them the Three Musketeers. That name's kind of stuck. I think that's a little bit of that is us looking back, right? Because of our, the authors that have had modern staying power, and I think this is something Bobby could speak to. They weren't always necessarily the most popular or even most prolific writers for the magazine, but they're the three that transcended that magazine, and we still remember them today. And let's talk maybe a little bit about how they got in and when they got in. Bobby, you want to talk about that, the timeline? Yeah. Lovecraft was there from the beginning, right?
Lovecraft was there from almost the beginning. Yeah, he wrote his first letter to the editor in 1923, and he said, "My dear sir, having a habit of writing weird, macabre, and fantastic stories for my own amusement, I have lately been simultaneously hounded by nearly a dozen well-meaning friends into deciding to submit a few of these gothic horrors to your newly founded periodical. The decision is herewith carried out." And this was Lovecraft right in the middle of his amateur journalism phase. He sent these manuscripts in longhand, tied with a bit of string. And Edwin Beard, you can just imagine him getting these in the mail and throwing them right in the crap basket. But J.C. Henenberger read the letter and went through the stories, and he said, "All right, if you will type these up, we might buy them," and they did. And that was the beginning of Lovecraft's association with the magazine, an association that would include 49 stories under his own name, plus many under the names of his revision clients and collaborators. And those early Weird Tales were also read by a young Robert E. Howard, who submitted stories for Baird, but Baird did not accept them. It was Wright that first got them, if you want to talk about it.
Sure, we could do that. Well, we pitch this one to Mark. So 2 years later, 1925, Howard had submitted a few stories, but he finally broke into Weird Tales with Spear and Fang.
That's right. And this was Howard's first professional sale. And of course, he had been writing prior to this as well, mostly in like the school newspapers, and he'd sent off some poems and won a couple of prizes for some of these things. The thing that he won the gold piece for was a Golden Hope Christmas, and that was just a short, kind of in the vein of, Bret Hart, kind of a, cute little ending. And it's kind of interesting to read that and then go read Spear and Fang, because Spear and Fang is, Neanderthal versus Cro-Magnon in a savage world, in the midst. It's incredibly Howardian, and also kind of interesting that it made it into Weird Tales, because even early on, I don't think they really had a distinctive thing that the Weird Tale itself was their rubric, and not ghost stories or detective thrillers. They were kind of, I would go so far as to consider them, at least early on, genreless. And in not having a specific set, we only do ghost stories, we only do confessionals. Robert was one of the people that benefited from that because he got to put in things that were hybrids and that were kind of one-offs. He got a toehold in by doing his own thing, which is how his whole career was.
Well, and that's an interesting thing because, to follow up on that, because Spear and Fang, it's a caveman story. There's no real obvious supernatural or weird element to it unless you count the Neanderthal, right? Who does, they do sort of play the role of monsters in the story.
Right.
And he was actually, it seems a little bit weird now, but caveman stories were a popular genre during this period, right? He was kind of copying off a guy named Paul Anderson, who had been writing a series of these caveman stories for Argosy magazine. Obviously it was a topic that Howard himself was into. He loved, you see themes of evolution and hominids and things like that throughout his fiction. So this was sort of a way that he got in. And he followed up with, not long after that, with The Lost Race, which also, it doesn't really have a weird element, but it's still kind of playing with weird evolution, maybe, right? I think it's been called weird Darwinism, is what Jonas Preda called it, in one episode. And Howard wasn't the only one doing this. There were others in Weird Tales doing this sort of thing.
Clark Ashton Smith was a relative latecomer. He did not get into Weird Tales until 1930. And that was because he was a teen prodigy at poetry. He published his first poetry in the 19-teens. He had books out. He wasn't very successful at it. He was arguably the poorest of the three, and he had the least amount of formal education, but the most poetic talent. So he was spending a lot of time trying to get little publishing projects off into the press to get some money. He was working day jobs, picking fruit, chopping firewood, and in the late 20s, as he got more and more into correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft, he was pushed into, maybe I can do this pulp writer thing, and he did. And Weird Tales was one of his first and best markets. But he wasn't always appreciative of it because, like most of the others, like Lovecraft, like Howard, occasionally he would run up against an editorial wall on something he wanted to publish. There's one letter here. As to Weird Tales, I suspect that Wright's readers aren't as dumb as he seems to think them, and therefore the sale may have fallen off a little with the late punk issues. I told Wright in a letter yesterday that the stories in it were disappointing and commented expressly on the Quinn yarn as being a mere detective story rather than a weird. I might have said quite a mouthful about some of the other tales, but refrained. If there are many more issues like this, I shall indulge in some rather frank criticism. Either Wright's judgment is growing altogether stale and undependable, or else he is making an express bid for the patronage of Morania. Now, there's something very important about that letter in it's not a weird tale. And what it is, Lovecraft and his definition of a weird tale and what he thought weird fiction should be was beginning to shape the magazine. Because Lovecraft was in correspondence with Wright, and he was in correspondence with Smith and Howard and all these other people, and they were sort of moving away from that genreless off-trail thing that was the early Weird Tales under Edwin Baird, and defining it more as their own thing. And that's part of what makes these guys stand out as the three Weird Tailors that we all remember today, is that not just were they some of the best writers that ever came out of that period from 1923 to 1954, but they had that shared aesthetic. Even though their stories are so very different in style and approach, they were the best writers, and they shared that love of what was weird fiction as we've come to know it to be.
That's an important point. Let's talk about that for just a second, right? And because that's something that you're starting to see across the pulps as a whole, and that is the creation of what we think of as modern genres, right? and that was very much taking place within the speculative fiction pulps. You had Weird Tales. In 1926, you got Amazing Stories, which was the first completely science, what we would today call science fiction. They didn't even have a good word for it back then. Scientific romances, and then scientifiction.
Scientifiction,
right? Yeah, pseudo-scientific, right? And you had stories like these in the genre pulps like Argosy and All Story that would publish all different genres, right? But this is the first time you start seeing in the 20s the pulps start to specialize in genres.
Right.
Even getting hyper specific, like Zeppelin stories and railroad stories and things
Engineering
like
stories, yeah.
right? Speakeasy stories, right?
Tales of the people who built this country.
Right, and
That's
that was happening in speculative fiction. And Bobby, what you alluded to, I think, is a very important part of how that happened, and that was in the correspondence, right? And it wasn't just the correspondence between the writers, the professional authors, like Lovecraft, Howard, Smith, Long, Price, some of the other guys, but also between the fans.
Yeah, and the
Erie, the editors, the letters pages.
That was huge.
It was a time where I know Nicole Immelhans uses the term discourse community and talks about this some. Jason's wife. That was what was going on at this time, and people were trying to figure out, what is this stuff that we're writing? What is this stuff that we're reading? What is this weird fiction? What is science fiction? What is, right? You see this in the early fanzines, right? You start to develop a fan community, and it was a time where fans and professionals, that the lines between them were much grayer.
I think you can look at it like a Venn diagram with multiple groups, and then there's weird overlaps that happen because the professional guys were clocking the Erie comments every month fervently, because that was
the letters column.
In some cases, the only kind of feedback they were getting. If Wright sent stuff back, he might have put a note in there of encouragement or whatever, or he talked to somebody in person. But here you could see people that didn't have a commercial relationship with Howard saying, man, that Conan is dreamy, give me more of him, and they also did polls in Weird Tales where they would vote, the readers would vote on what their favorite stories were. And so this community, and then what they would talk about would end up in the letters to one another. And they would tell tales out of school about what Wright accepted and rejected, and there's a huge overlap, and it all was everybody influenced all of it in turn.
One of the greatest examples of this, and one of the funniest examples, is in some of the early fanzines. You see some of this. You've probably heard the famous story about Hugo Gernsback when he first started publishing in the letters columns people's addresses, not just their names. For the first time, fans could start interacting with each other in the late 20s, and from that developed fanzines and things like that. One of the best is in a fanzine called Fantasy Fan, which was really some of the fanzines were more aimed at the science fiction pulp, some were aimed more at the fantasy and horror pulps, what we would today call fantasy and horror pulp, like Weird Tales. There was a great argument that was going on in this fanzine between
Boris J. Ackerman.
Ackerman, who at this time was about 16 or so. How many people have heard of Forrest Ackerman, right? Famous Monsters of Filmland, right? Yeah. So Ackerman was mad that Clark Ashton Smith had published some stories in Wonder Stories, right? Which was supposed to be a science fiction pulp or scientifiction, right? And he was saying that's he's really that's weird fiction or fantasy. He should be doesn't belong in Wonder Stories. He should be publishing that in Weird Tales, right? So you're already getting like these arguments over what are these genres that we're starting to define. What are the genre rules, the unofficial rules of these genres? And Lovecraft is coming back, and you get this back and forth between this obnoxious teenage Forrest Ackerman in a flame war, internet style, like it's Twitter, right? Except in 1931, going back and forth, 32, something like that, going back and forth with Lovecraft by snail mail over multiple issues, right? So this flame war lasted for months, right? Because they had to wait for the next issue to get there before they could come back. But what they're arguing about is, what are these genres, right? These new genres that we're experimenting with, and they were influencing each other. These fans that in a few years would become professionals themselves. Some of them would become editors, like Ray Palmer, Mort Weisinger. They would become the new professionals. So you've got this interaction, and Howard, Lovecraft, and Smith were right at the core, of the development of these genres.
Bobby, when did Lovecraft write supernatural horror in literature?
The first version was in 1925. He
Okay.
continued to revise it
Yeah.
almost up until his death. But it's important to remember that all this time we're talking about the fans and what really is the beginning of a sort of hero worship for some favorite authors, which, can happen in any genre, in any medium. All right, you've got a writer with a name that you recognize, you really like his stuff, you go and you read all of it. This does not always reach all the way to the editors of Weird Tales. Like, Farnsworth Wright knew that Robert E. Howard was popular because he could see the letters coming in from the fans, and they were all liking the Conan stuff, but that doesn't always translate into sales. H.P. Lovecraft is probably the most reprinted author from Weird Tales today, but he was also the least published of the three people we call the Three Musketeers of Weird Tales. And the most popular guy of all time at Weird Tales was a guy named Seabury Quinn. And he was sometimes in the 60s and 70s by people like E. Huffman Price. They called him the Third Musketeer of Weird Tales. But Seabury, they called it was like Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Seabury Quinn, because Seabury Quinn published several hundred stories. He had 158 stories and articles. 93 of them were the adventures of Jules de Grandin, his serial character. And if you read them next to Howard or Lovecraft or Smith today, you sort of wonder what all the fuss is about. And the fuss is about Quinn was writing for a contemporary audience. He wasn't trying most of the time to do anything very special or exciting, but he was filling a need and the fans loved it. It was like newspaper comics today, okay? You're not going to see anything necessarily shocking and terrific on there, but people liked it and they get upset if Garfield's not on there anymore.
Right.
But, that's what editors were looking for, was who's going to help me buy the issue, who's going to fill this page, who's going to, sell this issue. Farnsworth Wright said Seabury Quinn saved the magazine once with his big serial, The Devil's Bride, which ran 6 parts. But what the magazine is remembered for is not Seabury Quinn. It's H.P. Lovecraft and Robbie Howard and Clark Ashton Smith, because they were so good, because they were republished, but also because they had that interaction that went down to the level of fiction.
Yeah.
And we talk about the Cthulhu mythos a little bit too much sometimes, but...
And yet, it's with good reason, because this was unique in terms of what they were doing. I always think of it in terms of literary hoaxes, because to this day there are people who will walk into a bookstore and ask for a copy of the Necronomicon, and then when you take them to the one that was written, he goes, "No, I mean the real Necronomicon." Well, buddy, let's following your line of logic, you're in the wrong library. You should go to Arkham and find it there. But I love the fact that this was a kind of a call and response. It was the first Easter egg, right? Before we knew what that was, before that was even a thing. And the very idea also of everybody kind of knowing their limits. I mean, Howard didn't have access to a library unless he went out of town. He ordered books in the mail, but, he, like so many people, read those references and thought, is there something I don't know? What is this all from, And so, like other people did, they wrote to Lovecraft and asked him, hey, is this stuff real? And so I love the fact that he let everybody play with it. I love the fact that you have those references are kind of an understructure to this whole body of work. And some of it is pedestrian. Some of it's just, for a lark. I mean, I love Robert Bloch, but not all of his mythos stories are great. Some of them are pretty by the numbers, and there's a lot of by the numbers things in there. But that they all have this sort of source code leavened into the work gives the magazine a kind of an implied structure, even though there wasn't necessarily one, even while they were codifying their work. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, they're referencing each other's things. You're right. It's really more just name dropping and Easter eggs. It would probably be, going too far to call it, a shared universe. It wasn't that. Right?
Although it's been argued.
It's been argued, right? But it was in some ways the beginning of that kind of thinking, right? Things like shared universes and crossovers and those kinds of things that's the kind of thing we take for granted today in a post comic book world, really, right? But it wasn't something that happened very often, during those days. And so even just name dropping a character or a esoteric book or whatever in a different author's story. It gave it that verisimilitude is a word that gets thrown out a lot, right? With this, making it seem a little bit more real. Real enough, like you said, even Howard was fooled, right?
Yeah.
And had to ask Lovecraft, hey, is this thing real? Because I saw it referenced in this other guy's story, right? And that is really fun, and that is, it was somewhat unprecedented. I mean, there are some other examples of that kind of thing going on, but not to this level,
And the other thing about that I wanted to briefly mention is Lovecraft was the first guy to do it, and then when Howard picked it up and started doing it, they sort of pulled Smith in,
right? Kind of.
Well, we'll reference your stuff, and then you can maybe do something back. I mean, he played along,
right?
But it widened everybody's footprint. I don't know. I hate that word. You're right. Everybody's writing their own stuff, and they're relatively isolated. I mean, aside from letters, which were the currency of most of their friendships, Howard was writing basically by himself. Most of the feedback he got was in letter form. Lovecraft, even though he had a lot of friends, you sit in a room by yourself when you do all of this. Smith was on, the other side of the country from everybody else, and he was definitely by himself, And so that these stories were coming out, and they had little pieces and parts of other people's stories in it. It makes it feel bigger than it really probably was. And I don't know if it's I think what it does is it sort of creates an idea. Well, if I've read this, if I've read about nameless cults here, and I've read about the Necronomicon here, and they're mentioning both over here, I need to read the rest of this stuff. If like a lot of us, we'll chase them all down. You got to catch them all. And I think that was that's certainly something that the people in Weird Tales, the readers picked up on. They mentioned it in the letter columns, and it was hotly debated. And even to the point that Lovecraft released a false, history of the Necronomicon that, as soon as it made the rounds, everybody was like, see, it does exist.
It's really important to harp on one thing that Mark said, is that all of these guys were not writing pastiches of each other. They weren't trying to make a coherent mythology. They were each writing their own stories in their own way, and it incorporated this shared material.
Yeah.
And that's important because they're writing very different things. H.P. Lovecraft's stuff is his cosmic horror. The Shadow over Innsmouth is nothing like anything Robert E. Howard or Clark Ashton Smith ever wrote or would ever write. Robert E. Howard created these series of characters in Weird Tales. Solomon Kane in 1928, King Kull in 1929. Bran McMorn showed up with King Kull in Kings of the Night in 1930 in one of the first big crossovers. Conan finally hits the scene in 1932. You know, you've got these series of big action characters that he's coming up with, totally different. And then you've got Clark Ashton Smith, who's often overlooked because he wasn't writing series characters, he was writing series settings.
Yeah.
He would have Averone, he would have Zothique, which is after the end in the twilight era of the Earth, the dying Earth. He'd have Poisidana. Hyperborea.
Hyperborea, yeah.
So, you know, Smith doesn't have the strong characters that Howard does. And he doesn't necessarily have the same kind of one-shot Miskatonic Valley stuff that Lovecraft was doing. But his language was like nothing else anybody could write. It was evocative. You needed a thesaurus for each paragraph, but it was, if you ever do go through his stuff with a dictionary, he might use a weird $4 word, but is the exact right word for what he wants to get. And, you know, these guys were poets, and that worked into everything they had. And when we're saying that the magic died in 1939 when Farnsworth Wright was no longer editor of Weird Tales, that's in part because 2/3 of the Musketeers were dead.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the ending. You know, in 1936, of course, as we know, Howard took his life, and that sent ripples through the magazine, you know, and you know, it affected a lot of people. And then 1 year later, Lovecraft passes away. So it was a 1-2 punch, you know, for the magazine. Bobby, you want to talk about that and how it affected things? You know, and Smith then, you know.
Smith, you got to remember, Smith was living alone in a cabin by this point in California. Both of his parents were dead, didn't have a lot of money, he was doing day jobs, and suddenly his two best friends in the world almost die. And that aspect of his creativity almost dries up. Smith had more stories published in Weird Tales from 1923 to 1954 than Robert E. Howard, but that's only because he lived longer. You know, his creative output after 1937 just dwindles right down. You know, he turned his energies in other fashion because it wasn't fun anymore. He didn't have his friends to encourage him.
Yeah.
And the fans realized that they had lost something. Even though Lovecraft had never been a very common appearance in the pages in the late 30s because Wright got increasingly, he didn't like to publish longer stories. And Lovecraft was writing longer stories. At the Mountains of Madness is a novel.
Yeah.
A Shadow Out of Time is a novel. They're really hard to just break up into a pulp format. So, you know, a lot of that later Lovecraft stuff never showed up in Weird Tales. But after that, those guys go away, there's like, okay, oh my God, we've got a Robert E. Howard shaved hole, how do we fill it? And they never really did.
Yeah, that's true. And then, of course, just a couple of years, with sales going down, just a couple of years later, Wright is, well, they're bought out, basically, and Wright is let go eventually. They get a new editor, and it goes in a completely different direction, the magazine does. And that's, so you talk about 23 to 54 as being the first run of Weird Tales, but in a lot of ways, it's 23 to 39 is really this first run, that first era, you know, the Baird and then Wright era. And then after that, things went in a very different direction, and that was kind of the end of the golden age with the end of the Three Musketeers, effectively.
Well, it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny because they knew they'd lost something, and they tried to fix it. When in the 1940s, when McIlthraith talked to Manly Wade Wellman,
The new editor.
yeah,
Replaced. Right.
McIlthraith was the new editor. Manly Wade Wellman was a new writer. He had tried to get in the late 1930s under Wright, didn't quite work out. And now he was creating characters for Weird Tales because they wanted a series character that had sort of the panache of Conan, if only to fill the gap. And he created first Judge Percevant and then John Thunstone. And the funny thing is that Manly Wade Wellman and Seabury Quinn turned out to be really good friends because they were both in New York at the time. And Seabury Quinn was still chugging along, churning out these Jules de Grandin stories. And you can see in the later issues of Weird Tales, the John Thunstone stories start referring to Jules de Grandin, and Jules de Grandin stories start referring to Thunstone and Percevant and Manly Wade Wellman. So it feels like they're trying to capture some of that magic shared setting material, but it never quite gelled. They never had a real crossover. They were never doing the same kind of creative back and forth that these guys did back in the 30s. And, you know, it's fun to read, but it's also obvious that they're kind of copying what came before, and that lessens the magic.
Yeah.
Right. They also tried to you know, they posted or published a lot of posthumous stories, right? At this point, a lot of Howard stuff that, you know, was, you know, unfinished, unpublished. Maybe some of it should have been published, maybe some of it shouldn't have. Started, you know, making its way into Weird Tales as well. Same with Lovecraft. They started reprinting, you know, doing a lot of reprints. But yeah, it was trying to hang on. It was trying to cling to something that just wasn't there anymore.
Yeah.
You know.
I want to sort of. I have a thought and it's gone. Never mind. We'll circle back.
Well, what do you think? Should we, you guys have anything else you want to add before we pitch it out to questions? Or
I'll just say one last thing. It's to go off what you said about trying to do what they had before with the posthumous publication, especially the August Derleth posthumous collaborations with H.P. Lovecraft. There was a very strong nostalgic vibe for the right era.
Mm-hmm.
And they were trying to capture that again. And, you know, they knew they didn't have it, but they also knew they had to do something to save the magazine. And this seemed to be what the fans wanted.
Yeah.
So, you know, the fans can want what they think they want, but it's not going to be exactly what they're going to get.
Right. Yeah, that first era was lightning in a bottle. You know, it would have. It was kind of dumb luck that they were writing at the same time, and in a magazine that encouraged letter writing and communication and
experimentation.
And yeah, it was. You know, you can't remake that thing which was not originally made. It was, you know,
it grew organically.
It was
right.
very organic, and I love a really good example. Since we're talking about Howard Days, is the Black Stone. It's widely considered one of his best Cthulhu mythos stories, if not his best, and it's firmly in that larger housing of the mythos stories. It is nothing like what Lovecraft wrote, but it was exactly the reason why Lovecraft loved it is because they were both looking at folklore, and they were both looking at the sort of, you know, they were both writing about what we don't know from history. And Howard was doing it in more than one way, but with Lovecraft and him talking about how the stories change over time and how they mutate and how they morph, Howard took that conversation and wrote his version of it. And that's why it's a very unique take on, you know, how we get there. And of course, Smith was doing the same thing. Compared to, say, Robert Bloch, who was much younger when he first made it into the magazine. He was certainly a technically proficient writer, but he broke no new ground. He basically took this book, that thing, this thing, and made a deal. He was playing with other people's toys, and what makes the reason why these guys are remembered for what they are, and it sounds like I'm picking on Robert Bloch. I love Robert Bloch. He's the author of Psycho.
Right. He found his own voice eventually.
He got it. He got out and did his own thing. That's not what this is about. It's just that there were so many people in that Lovecraft circle, those correspondents, those people that were everything from a trusted confidant to a hanger-on, and someone that he maybe kindly indulged. And we're not talking about them, right? That's the difference. Anyways.
I guess one last thing to say, just to touch on, you mentioned August Derleth. For all of people complaining about the posthumous collaborations, I think it's important to note that some of this material may not have survived if it hadn't been for Derleth and Wandrei founding Arkham House. A small press. It was dedicated to preserving first Lovecraft, but then also Smith and Howard and many of the other Weird Tales writers in small press editions. Up to, I guess they're still around even, right? When was the last time they published something? I know there's a different iteration of it, but,
long time. His grandkids have the business now.
Right.
But it is because of Arkham House that we can talk about the Weird Tailors, the Three Musketeers of Weird Tales, because that sort of codified their status, was how they got published. I mean, Arkham House also published Henry S. Whitehead, but nobody would consider Henry S. Whitehead to be... Yeah.
Nobody even got that reference except for Bobby. Damn. That was deep.
But yeah, it was very obvious from the beginning that there were certain writers that the fans really responded to, and they wanted more of, and they got more of.
Yeah. I don't think it's coincidental that Arkham House was founded when it was founded. At the time that everybody was looking for, you remember these guys? Oh, yeah, they were so cool. I mean, it was purely, that's what that was, know.
What year was Outsider, the first one, 39?
1939.
Yeah, so within 2 years of Lovecraft's death.
Yeah.
They were starting to do that, and it did establish one of the earliest versions of a weird fiction canon.
That's right.
I think you can think of it that way. You could argue about how well he did that, but it was certainly the first attempt to do that. And it.
Well, again, if you look at Derleth's correspondence with Dorothy McIlrath, she knew what she was buying, and he knew what he was writing. And in Derleth's mind, he was not doing any different from when Lovecraft would completely rewrite his revision clients and let them use their name.
Yeah.
For his perspective, that's all he was doing. And, so we sort of vilified Derleth today. And Derleth was another one of those very prolific Weird Tales writers. He had over 100 stories in Weird Tales. But you don't really remember Bats Belfry on the same level as the Dunwich Horror, because, like Robert Bloch, he wasn't really finding his own voice. He was doing these little pieces, and he was, they're pot boilers. It's stuff he would submit again and again to write. Said, all right, you've got a gap in the issue. Let's throw a Derleth story in there.
Yeah.
Well, listen, on that note, maybe it's time to pitch it out to the audience for some questions.
Sure.
How much did Smith and Howard work together? Because the Hyboria stuff and Conan and all that, how much do they influence each other?
That's a good question. It's an excellent question.
I think they were coming from different. They were pulling from different influences.
Yes and no.
Smith's letters to Robert E. Howard do not survive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have an essay about that in my book, Weird Tailors.
Right.
But they weren't really talking about Atlantis and Hyperborea and all that. But it's very interesting that they both chose to focus on very different stages in Atlantis.
Yeah.
Robert E. Howard's Atlantis in the Cull stories is before it becomes this great magical civilization. And Clark Ashton Smith, he's like after the peak when it's in decline.
Right. Poseidonus, right? Which was, both of them were pulling from the same sources ultimately, because a lot of this stuff is coming from theosophy and
I didn't realize
occult
Smith
sources.
used all that. I didn't
But
used all that.
they
philosophy.
did different things with them.
Yeah.
And Howard was pulling from other sources too, with his earlier prehistoric Atlantis. That was coming from a guy named Lewis Spence, who was kind of like the Graham Hancock of his day. So they were pulling from same sources, but doing very different things with him and
Right.
going in different ways with them to some degree. I saw Deuce's hand up because I know he loves this stuff. You got something. Jump in here, man.
Well, not so much to address that
All right.
totally, but the fact is that, you know, as not pointed out, and Joshi consistently gets it wrong, Robert E. Howard introduced Sithog to the world in Children of the Dark,
Right.
and, or sorry, Children of the Night.
Right.
Excuse me. And, you know, he heard about Sithog in a letter from Lovecraft and got so excited about it, he just had to go ahead and put it in there.
Right. So we think of Sithogwa today as a Clark Ashton Smith creation, and it was, right? But Howard actually beat him in print.
And Howard and
Yeah.
Lovecraft wrote more about Sithogwa in a lot of
Right.
ways than Smith did. It actually shaped the image of him more in a lot of ways than Smith.
Right. And we see that with Thog and Thaug, and right, these are all sort of Sithogwa, knockoffs.
And the story that was referring to, the Tale of Satompra's Arrows,
Mm-hmm.
that's, you know, when that came out, there hadn't been, because it is basically a sword and sorcery story.
Right.
There hadn't been a story like that from Howard.
Right. No, that was a very Dunsanian story, really.
You got two good old boys, never meaning no harm, you know.
Right. Rusty wants to jump in here.
Well, that kind of leads into something I was going to say about
Right.
this. If you get away from the subject matter and the character, stylistically, for instance, Rogues in the House is a very mannered kind of story in the style of Clark Ashton Smith.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not it's not typical of R.D. Howard.
Right.
Yeah, the scrying windows and the mirrors and things. Yeah.
There are influences that are stylistic,
Right.
opposed to subject matter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point with Rogues.
I would argue that if as close to a Howardian story that Lovecraft ever wrote, it was the Shadow over Innsmouth.
Right.
With-
Where you actually
with-
get some action.
Yeah,
A little bit.
with chases and
Little
fights
bit.
on the docks. Well, I mean,
For Lovecraft.
for Lovecraft, that's a potboiler.
Right.
Yeah.
That was absolutely. They weren't quivering on the floor in a fetal position, gibbering,
Mm.
right?
There's a fist fight at the end of Horror in the Museum, too.
That's true. Yep, that's true.
They were
He's
learning.
going on Steve Cosby on that.
Yeah, exactly. Jason.
At the end of Blood and Thunder, Mark, you say that the humorous Western is Howard's true storytelling voice. And I'm wondering if there are examples of Smith or Lovecraft stories where it's their true voice, where like they're mostly themselves.
What is their true voice, you mean? Which stories represent their true voice?
Where there are no influences, right? There are no external influences obscuring their style. Like, are there any quintessential? What is the quintessential Clark Ashton Smith?
Boy, it would probably be one of his prose poems, don't you think, maybe?
The quintessential Clark Ashton Smith story. God, that's a question.
I'd say his very, very first piece.
The
Yeah.
Abominations.
The Abominations of
Of
Yondo.
Yondo.
Yeah, that's very much a prose poem,
Right.
but not separate from the actual prose poems he did, but that is very much an evocative mood piece. And yeah, I could see that one, because he
Yeah.
did in later, like the Black Abbot of Bethune is very much in the sword and sorcery
Right.
vein for Clark Ashton Smith. I would say the most quintessential Clark Ashton Smith story is probably one of his most unusual, the end of the story.
Interesting. And for Lovecraft, that's a good question. He certainly has a couple of stories where early on where he's channeling Poe. He finds his voice. I think probably first more so with his Dreamland stories, but even those are Dunsanian. So it's probably going to be.
It's tempting to say Call of Cthulhu because
Yeah.
that's sort of where things officially kick off.
Even that, though,
But
is just kind of a more expanded version of Dagon in some ways.
I would,
right?
yeah, and I was thinking about.
Moments from the Moon Pool.
I was
Yeah.
thinking about
Right.
From Beyond as one of those.
Yeah.
Like, it's shorter and more succinct, but it's got all that stuff in it, and it doesn't feel like he's writing to the word.
Yeah, because you're right. There's a lot of merit in some of those
Color Out of
stories.
Space is the most cosmic horror.
Cosmic
Yeah.
horror. That's a good point.
Color Out
Out
of
of
Space
Space
is
is
a
a good
really
one.
good
Yeah,
one too.
that's a good one.
Pure cosmic horror.
Yeah.
Monsters or anything.
Weird alien thing comes in and kills everybody and moves on. No explanation.
Yeah.
You know?
Great question.
Sort of
Yeah.
Blackwood influence in there.
Yeah, that's true. That's tough. It's tough with Lovecraft. He's got a.
I mean, at the Mountains of Madness,
Right.
Poe reference, I mean,
He was always
Right.
working towards.
The white ape is Edgar Rice Burroughs, so he would probably never admit it in a million years.
Yes.
That's tough.
That reminded me of a question when you were talking about they were playing with the vague concept of a shared universe and that sort of thing. Do you think they were probably inspired by Burroughs? Because I know Burroughs was already doing shared universe within his own stories as well.
Well, it's funny. It's funny. I looked into that. So Tarzan at the Earth's Core, right, is one of the first ones that he does. It's published this right at the same year as Kings of the Night. The magazine version in Argosy, I think, predated it by a little bit. Because I wondered about that, if that didn't give Howard the idea to do a crossover as well. And
Stuff like The Moon Maid, I think, was crossover with Barsoom, and it was in the early 20s, I think.
oh, that does predate it. Yeah, that's right.
Savage was
Right.
crazy
That's
for
true.
us today.
Yeah, that's true.
He had a lot of crossover stuff going
Right.
before Howard and
Yeah, and Jules Verne did it as well.
Yeah.
You know, Jules Verne, did the same sort of thing. Mysterious Island was two of his other separate stories that had characters that came together.
Romer did it some too.
Sax Rohmer, and Dumas, Alexander Dumas also, where you get Musketeer references and.
But this, and I
A
think
few people were doing it,
But
but
they
it wasn't
were-
common.
But they were doing it. It's one thing to swipe from yourself,
Right.
and it's another thing to involve
Other right.
2 or 3 other writers' concepts in stuff. And so I think that's really why so many people want to consider it the first shared world in that respect. I kind of like that, I like calling it that because it does link up both in terms of geography, in terms of conceptually. There's a through line with all the books and the monsters, and for lack of a better thing, I don't know what else you would call it. I mean, there are certainly other better examples, but I gotta think that was the first one that matters.
Certainly the prototype for what we think of as shared universes.
Yeah.
What about Homer and Virgil? The Aeneid and the
Well,
Odyssey.
yes.
I mean, that was probably the first.
Yes, but if you want to consider that true, fiction you generally don't think of that as true fiction in the sense that we do today, right? Because they're really playing with mythology.
Also, they communicate with each other.
Right.
That's actually a good point, though, that I want to bring up, is part of the reason that Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and H.P. Lovecraft are the 3 Musketeers of Weird Tales is because a lot of those early stories are in the public domain. And that shared mythology, that shared setting material is also open for everybody to play with, and they have played with it.
Right.
Well, it's saying that, a series of books I'm currently reading, one by J. Stan Spock and Nick Cole called Forgotten Ruin, they reference Lovecraft, Howard, Smith, and dozens of others, and they'll be like, oh, you're acting just like Conan, stop doing that, or they'll bring up something about, oh, we're going to call this a Cthulhu horror thing, come up with a better name, that's already been used, and they'll do stuff like that, and then you'll hear the characters like, but it looks like that because that's what I've been told, and everybody in the stories are like, well, you got a point, we should just probably call it that because that's what we're seeing.
Right.
And to me, that kind of reference back to that shows that these authors grew up on that stuff, and they're kind of in a way paying a homage back to the 3 of them
Absolutely.
because they're seeing what they see and trying to write that kind of thing, I guess, in a way.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, the whole point is that by calling them the 3 Musketeers of Weird Tales, this is a fan label. This is very much coming from the fans deciding these are the 3 guys, the 3 writers, I should say, because there were women writing for Weird Tales too.
Absolutely.
These are the 3 that stand out the most from the crowd.
Yeah.
Who was the first to actually coin that phrase, 3 Musketeers?
That's a great question.
I believe it was E. Hoffman Price.
It sounds like the kind of thing Price would come up with.
Yeah. It was like, it's E. Hoffman Price would give 3 in one place and then a different 3 in another place, and I think then DeCamp picked it up, and DeCamp was very focused.
Lovecraft book he did was dedicated to the 3 Musketeers.
Yeah.
I feel like, just to segue out of that, that we should give a shout out to E. Hoffman Price, because as far as we know, he's the only man to actually meet all three of the Musketeers in real life.
Yeah.
He got many free drinks probably with those stories. I imagine.
I think we had one more question.
Looping back around, I think one thing that unites all of them is a certain interest in like the ancient and the esoteric, right? And a lot of concepts we consider like pseudoscience today, like Atlantis, Lemuria, Necronomicon, all that. Do you think that more came from like a shared interest, or is just more of a kind of, of the times interest?
How much time do we have?
I think the short answer is both, and the long answer is you need to buy Jeff a beer because he will absolutely give you the full rundown.
Right. My day job is an archaeologist, but I do a lot of work with pseudo-archaeology and how, especially pulp fiction writers, and make use of early pseudo-archaeology. And the answer is, yeah, they absolutely were. Lovecraft was kind of turned on to it early on. Price was very much into theosophy. Many of them loved reading about this stuff. They didn't actually believe it, but realized, hey, this is great material for fiction. And they were borrowing from it. And Blavatsky's Book of Dizion, right, which is supposedly where the ancient book from the Ascended Masters that she got a lot of her insight from. That was very much the model for Lovecraft to create the Necronomicon, right? And he talks about this in his letters. I know you've done a lot of work on that, Bobby.
And you have to remember that at the time, they didn't have the internet, so it was a lot more difficult to tell what was true versus what was fiction.
Right.
So like Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe was widely accepted by many people for decades as more or less factual, especially because she got to write the article on witchcraft in the Encyclopedia Britannica. But, there was scholarly pushback at the time.
Like immediately, anthropologists were already like, no, this is what we would today call pseudoscience, right? There was immediate pushback, even though people accepted it.
Yeah,
in the popular audience.
But that pushback didn't make it into the newspapers by and large.
Right.
So Lovecraft really accepted it.
Did or did not make it?
Did not.
So that was sort of the at this time period, the start of the 20th century. It took a long time to publish a book, and then it took a long time to have that book be distributed, and it took a long time for people to read and then make comments on a book. And so if the book had bad science in it, it might be the book that you read for 10 years before something else came along. And one of the big problems I have with academia then and now is a lot of these heated discussions take place behind closed doors in ivory towers, and you never hear about it. It's getting better with the internet, but there's still this need to hoard the knowledge. And so Howard was reading stuff that was already out of
He was
vogue.
reading stuff that would have been like the Graham Hancock of today, right? He
Yeah.
was very much into this stuff and using some of it. He thought, well, maybe that's real, whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's great material for my fiction, right? And they
Yeah.
were all doing that. Smith, Lovecraft, Howard, all of them. We are probably out of time. Yeah, I wish I could keep talking about this. You touched on my subject. But we got about 5 minutes until the next panel, which is the Glenn Lord Symposium. So I would encourage everyone, we got 5 minutes. Take a bathroom break, grab some water, and come on back. We're going to do see some of the really great academic work that's being done on Howard.
Yes, the cutting edge.
Yeah, good stuff.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
everyone.